Here's something to think about. How many times have you said something in the heat of the moment, maybe out of frustration, anger, or the need to prove a point, only to regret it later? That instant when the words leave your mouth, and almost immediately you wish you could pull them back. Maybe it was during an argument with someone you care about. Maybe it was in a meeting where you spoke just to fill the silence. Or maybe you responded to an insult when the smartest move would have been to say nothing at all. Silence. It's one of the most underrated forms of power. And yet, in a world where everyone is trying to be heard, on social media, in conversations, in meetings, in debates, choosing silence can feel almost unnatural. We're conditioned to believe that speaking up means control, that having the last word means victory. But the truth? The most powerful people in history, the wisest minds, the most composed leaders, they knew that silence is often the best move you can make. Think about Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome. He had absolute power, yet his greatest strength wasn't in how loudly he spoke. It was in his restraint. He understood that wisdom isn't just about what you say, it's about what you choose not to say. In his meditations, he reminds himself, you always have the option of having no opinion. Imagine that for a second. You don't always have to react, you don't always have to engage, and when you learn to master that skill, you take back control, not just over situations, but over yourself. We live in a world that worships quick reactions. A headline pops up, and we're expected to have an opinion. Someone insults us, and we feel the need to defend ourselves immediately. A friend vents about their problems, and we rush to offer advice, even when they don't need it. But have you ever stopped to wonder, what if my silence is more powerful than my words? What if, in some situations, the greatest wisdom isn't found in speaking, but in waiting, in observing, in letting things unfold without interference? Let's talk about anger. One of the easiest times to say something you'll regret. You know that moment when your heart is pounding, your face is hot, and you feel that urge to lash out, to defend yourself, to prove that you're right. That's the moment when silence becomes a weapon of the wise. Seneca, one of the great Stoic philosophers, wrote extensively about anger. He called it a temporary form of madness. When we let anger take over, it distorts reality. It makes us react rather than respond, and that's when we make mistakes. But if you pause, if you sit with the anger instead of giving it a voice, you gain something most people don't have: control. Picture this: you're in a heated argument with someone, a partner, a colleague, a friend. They say something that stings. You can feel the words rising in your throat, ready to fire back. But instead, you stop. You breathe. You let the moment pass without feeding it. What happens? The tension starts to fade. The conversation shifts. And most importantly, you don't say something you'll later regret. That's power. That's mastery. And that's something the Stoics understood better than anyone. But it's not just anger. Silence is also an antidote to something equally destructive: gossip. Now let's be real, gossip is tempting. There's something intoxicating about being in the know, about hearing the latest drama, about feeling like you're part of the conversation. But engaging in gossip, adding to it, spreading it, does something dangerous. It chips away at your integrity. Epictetus warned about this centuries ago. If someone speaks ill of you, do not make excuses, but say, "He must not know me very well, otherwise he would have spoken even worse." In other words, don't engage, don't defend yourself, don't add fuel to the fire, because the moment you step into the cycle of gossip, you lose something invaluable: your self-respect. And here's the twist: silence, when used correctly, can actually elevate you in the eyes of others. The person who doesn't rush to speak, who doesn't react emotionally, who doesn't waste words, they're seen as composed, confident, in control. People listen when they do speak, because their words are rare and deliberate. Think about the most respected people in your life. Are they the ones who talk endlessly, or are they the ones who choose their words carefully? This is where the real power of silence lies, not just in what it prevents, but in what it creates. It creates presence, it creates clarity, it creates a sense that you don't need to prove anything to anyone. Because when you truly understand this, when you embody it, you start to see something remarkable. Not everything needs a reaction. Not every insult needs a comeback. Not every problem needs immediate fixing. Not every moment of silence needs to be filled. But there's more. Because silence isn't just about holding back in anger or avoiding gossip. It's also a strategic tool, one that can be used to win negotiations, make better decisions, and even strengthen relationships. And coming up next, I'm going to show you the moments where silence isn't just the right move, it's the most powerful move you can make. You won't want to miss this. You know, one of the hardest things about mastering silence is breaking the habit of always feeling the need to respond. It's instinctual. Someone says something, we reply. Someone asks a question, we answer. Someone makes a claim, we counter. But what if silence isn't just a lack of response? What if it's a strategic choice? One that gives you more influence, more control, more peace. Imagine this. You're in a room with a group of people, and the conversation turns into gossip. Maybe they're criticizing a colleague, mocking someone's choices, dissecting another person's life. You feel that pull. You could add something, share a detail, agree just to fit in. But instead you choose silence. You don't engage. You don't contribute. You simply listen. And something interesting happens. The energy shifts. Some people notice your lack of participation. They might even feel uncomfortable because silence does something strange. It forces people to reflect. And the best part? You walk away with your integrity intact. Seneca had a beautiful way of putting it. He said, "It is a great thing to know the season for speech and the season for silence." And isn't that exactly what wisdom is? Knowing when to step in and when to hold back? The truth is, a lot of what we say isn't necessary. It's just noise, an attempt to fill the space, to be heard, to assert ourselves. But real strength comes from knowing that you don't always have to engage. You don't have to explain yourself. You don't have to share everything. And you certainly don't have to lower yourself to match the negativity around you. I've seen it happen time and time again. People underestimate the power of silence in situations where ego is at play. Take insults, for example. When someone insults you, your natural reaction is to defend yourself, to fire back, to prove them wrong. But what happens when you don't? When you just let their words hang in the air without giving them anything to feed on? The person who insulted you suddenly loses control of the situation. They wanted a reaction, they wanted engagement, and now they're left with nothing but their own words. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply. He wrote, "You always own the option of having no opinion." Think about that. You don't have to defend yourself against every criticism. You don't have to react to every insult. Because the moment you do, you give away your power. But when you remain silent, when you refuse to engage, you stay in control. Now let's talk about something even trickier. Staying silent when you don't have all the facts. This one is tough because we live in a world where opinions are currency. People expect you to weigh in on everything, even when you don't fully understand the situation. There's this pressure to have an immediate stance, to pick a side, to say something, anything, just to be part of the conversation. But what if true wisdom means resisting that urge? What if it means admitting that you don't know enough to speak? That's a hard thing to do, especially in an age where being silent is sometimes mistaken for weakness. But the reality is, silence in these moments is actually a sign of intelligence. It means you're not easily manipulated. It means you value truth over ego. It means you're willing to wait, observe, and learn before making a judgment. I remember a time when I almost fell into this trap myself. There was a situation unfolding, a conflict between two people I knew. One side came to me, told me their story, made it seem like an open and shut case. My first instinct to take their side, to say, "Wow, I can't believe they did that to you." But something stopped me. Instead of reacting, I just listened. And sure enough, a few days later, I learned the full story. It wasn't so simple. There were details I hadn't known, perspectives I hadn't considered. If I had jumped in too soon, I would have made a mistake, aligned myself with something I didn't fully understand. That moment taught me something profound. The first version of a story is rarely the full version. And when you stay silent, you give yourself the space to see things as they really are. The same principle applies in negotiation. People think negotiation is all about saying the right thing, making the perfect argument, having the most persuasive words. But seasoned negotiators know the real secret. The power is in the pause. Say you're at a job interview and they ask about your salary expectations. Instead of blurting out a number, you pause. You let them speak first. Or imagine you're in a business deal and you make an offer. The other party hesitates. Most people rush to fill the silence, to justify, to tweak their proposal. But the one who stays quiet, they control the moment. Because silence makes people uncomfortable. It makes them reveal more than they intended. It shifts the dynamic in your favor. This is something ancient Stoics would have understood well. In a world where power was often determined by words, they recognized that silence was an even greater tool. Epictetus used to say that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. That we should listen twice as much as we speak. It's a simple idea, but how often do we actually practice it? How often do we listen just to understand rather than to respond? How often do we allow a pause to happen rather than rushing to fill the space? And then there's decision-making. If there's ever a time to practice silence, it's before making a big decision. We don't realize how much noise we allow into our heads. People's opinions, doubts, fears, external pressures. And when we act too quickly, when we let that noise dictate our choices, we end up making decisions that aren't truly ours. But silence allows for clarity. It creates space to filter out what doesn't matter and focus on what does. Some of the best decisions I've ever made weren't the ones I rushed into. They were the ones where I sat in stillness, let the dust settle, and waited for the truth to become clear. And that's really the core of all this. Silence creates clarity. Whether it's in a heated argument, a moment of gossip, an insult, a negotiation, or a major decision, choosing silence isn't just about not speaking. It's about making room for something deeper to emerge. Understanding, patience, wisdom. It's about learning that you don't always have to be the loudest person in the room to be the most powerful. So as you go about your day, I want you to pay attention. Notice the moments when you feel the urge to speak, to defend yourself, to prove a point, to react emotionally. And instead, try something different. Hold back. Pause. Let the silence do the work. See what happens when you let go of the need to fill every space with words. You might be surprised by the kind of power you uncover. And speaking of power, there's another side to silence that most people overlook. One that goes beyond self-control or strategic advantage. It's about something deeper, something even more profound. In the next part of this video, we're going to explore the hidden connection between silence and inner peace, why the people who speak the least often feel the most at ease, and how mastering this one skill can completely transform the way you move through the world. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. There's something about silence that makes people uncomfortable. It's almost like we're trained to avoid it. A conversation slows down, and suddenly there's this awkward tension. Someone has to fill the gap, say something, anything, just to make the silence disappear. But what if that silence isn't something to escape? What if it's something to lean into? Think about the last time you were with someone who just listened. Not someone who was waiting for their turn to talk. Not someone who was distracted, nodding absent-mindedly while scrolling through their phone, but someone who really, truly listened. How did that feel? There's something powerful about being around a person who doesn't rush to fill the air with words. It makes you feel heard. It makes you feel seen. And that's because silence isn't just the absence of noise. It's presence. This is why, when someone is venting, when they're opening up, unloading something heavy, your silence can be one of the most healing things you can offer. We often think that when someone shares their problems with us, we're supposed to fix them. Offer solutions. Say the right thing. But most of the time, people don't actually need advice. They need space. They need someone to sit in the silence with them and let them process their own emotions. Marcus Aurelius understood this well. He wrote, "Be tolerant with others and strict with yourself." That means giving people room to feel what they feel, without rushing to correct, debate, or solve everything. I remember a time when a friend came to me, upset about something deeply personal. My first instinct was to jump in, to try to say something wise, to make it better. But something stopped me. Instead, I just sat there. I nodded, I let them speak, and in that silence, something happened. They kept talking. They worked through their own thoughts, they found their own clarity, and at the end of it, they looked at me and said, "I really needed that." Not because I gave them the perfect answer, but because I didn't try to take their pain away with words. I simply let them have the space to feel it. This is something a lot of people struggle with, the urge to fill silence with empty comfort. We do it because we want to help, but often what we say doesn't actually help at all. When someone is grieving and we say, everything happens for a reason. When someone is struggling and we say, it'll all work out. These words might be well-intentioned, but they don't do anything. Sometimes the best thing you can say is nothing at all. Just be there. Just hold space. Because silence communicates something deeper than words ever could. It says, I see you, I hear you, and I'm not going to rush you through this. And this brings us to another kind of silence, the kind that happens when words won't change the outcome. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where arguing, explaining, or pleading wouldn't make a difference? Where, no matter what you said, it wouldn't shift reality? This is where most people waste their energy, fighting against what is, trying to win a battle that can't be won. But the Stoics knew that acceptance is one of the greatest forms of strength. Epictetus said, there is only one way to happiness, and that is to cease worrying about things which are beyond the power of our will. That means knowing when to stop talking, stop resisting, and let things be. It means recognizing when words will only add fuel to a fire that's already burning out of control. I've seen this play out in relationships, someone trying desperately to get closure, to force an apology, to explain their side over and over, hoping the other person will finally understand. But sometimes people aren't ready to hear you. Sometimes they won't hear you, no matter how well you articulate yourself. And in those moments, silence isn't just the wise choice, it's the only choice. I once knew someone who had a falling out with a close friend. There was a misunderstanding, things were said, and no matter how much they tried to explain, the other person wasn't open to hearing it. They kept writing long messages, trying to clear things up, trying to be understood, but it only made things worse. And then one day, they stopped. Not out of bitterness, not out of defeat, but because they finally understood. Some things are meant to be left unresolved. Some conversations don't need to happen. Some explanations don't need to be given. And in that silence, they found something unexpected: peace. This is the kind of silence that isn't passive. It's active detachment. It's the ability to say, I don't need to keep proving myself. I don't need to keep fighting for this. I can let go. And once you embrace that, something shifts. You stop wasting your energy on people who don't want to listen. You stop trying to force things that aren't meant to be forced. And suddenly, life feels lighter. But there's one last thing I want to talk about, because silence isn't just about self-control or emotional intelligence. It's also about deepening your connection to yourself. We spend so much of our lives absorbing noise, news, social media, opinions, entertainment, that we rarely just sit with ourselves. And that's a problem. Because if you don't give yourself silence, how do you know what you really think? How do you separate your own voice from the noise of the world? This is why the Stoics valued solitude. They knew that reflection, real, deep reflection, only happens in silence. Seneca wrote about this constantly. He believed that setting aside time for quiet contemplation wasn't just beneficial, it was necessary for a well-lived life. He would retreat, reflect, and ask himself hard questions. And if you think about it, this is something we've lost. In today's world, silence is rare. We're always consuming something. Videos, podcasts, music, notifications. Even in the quiet moments, we reach for our phones, check for updates, fill the space with distractions. But what would happen if you just sat in the silence? I challenge you, try it. Try sitting in stillness, even for a few minutes. No distractions, no noise. Just you, alone with your thoughts. It might feel uncomfortable at first. You might feel the itch to check your phone, to turn something on, to escape. But if you push through that, you'll start to notice something. Clarity, insight, a connection to yourself that you didn't realize was missing. Because here's the truth. If you can't sit in silence with yourself, you'll never truly understand yourself. And if you don't understand yourself, how can you expect to master anything else in life? So let's take a step back. We've talked about silence as a tool for self-restraint. Silence as a way to navigate conflict. Silence as a strategy for persuasion, for wisdom, for inner peace. But there's still one more layer to all of this, one more reason why silence isn't just powerful, but necessary. And in the next part of this video, we're going to go deeper. We're going to talk about how mastering silence isn't just about control, it's about freedom. The kind of freedom that comes from detaching from the need to be heard, from the need to prove, from the need to constantly engage with the world. And once you understand that, you'll never see silence the same way again. There's a kind of silence that isn't just about self-restraint or patience. It's something deeper, something most people never even think about. The kind of silence that gives you freedom. Most of us live in constant reaction mode. We react to conversations, to criticism, to praise, to news, to the tiniest ripple in our environment. It's like we're tethered to every little thing happening around us, always needing to respond, to assert, to engage. But what if you didn't? What if you could just let go? Not out of indifference, not out of avoidance, but out of a sense of deep, unshakable control over yourself. Imagine for a moment that someone criticizes you. They question your choices, your work, your character. Your instinct is to defend yourself, to correct them, to make sure they see things from your point of view. But what if you didn't? What if you just let their words float past you like a breeze? What if you saw them for what they really are, someone else's opinion, nothing more? This is the kind of freedom that silence can give you. The freedom to choose what actually deserves your energy. Marcus Aurelius understood this. He reminded himself in his meditations, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. That means realizing that most of what disturbs you is just your own reaction to things, not the things themselves. Someone insults you? That's just words in the air until you decide to absorb them. Someone disrespects you? That's just their behavior until you let it define you. When you stay silent, when you refuse to engage, you take away their power over you. You keep yourself untangled, untouched, free. Think about how often we talk simply to reassure ourselves. We explain, we justify, we try to prove something, not because others truly need to hear it, but because we need to say it, to feel validated, to feel understood. But real freedom is when you don't need that anymore. When you're secure enough in yourself that you don't have to explain, you don't have to convince, you don't have to fight for recognition. You just exist, fully in control, fully at peace. And this is where silence becomes the ultimate form of discipline. Because let's be honest, silence is hard. It's so much easier to react, to speak, to vent your emotions in the moment. But the people who can sit in silence, who can master that impulse, they're the ones who move through life with a different kind of power. It's the reason why the most respected figures in history weren't the ones who spoke the loudest, but the ones who knew when to hold back. Look at a great leader in any field. They don't scramble to answer every question the second it's asked. They don't blurt out their emotions in the heat of the moment. They pause, they think. They let silence work for them. And when they do speak, their words carry weight because they're rare, intentional, and deliberate. Even in our personal lives, we can see this play out. Have you ever been in an argument where someone refuses to engage, where they simply let the noise pass by them? It's infuriating, isn't it? Because silence is powerful. It disarms people, it shifts the dynamic. It forces them to confront their own words, rather than feeding off your reaction. This is something the Stoics understood deeply. They weren't about dominance or passive aggressiveness. They were about preserving their own energy, about recognizing that not every battle is worth fighting, that some things resolve themselves without interference. And that's the thing about silence. It allows the universe to handle things for you. Have you ever noticed that when you don't react, when you give things space, situations often resolve themselves? Conflicts fizzle out. Problems become clearer. People expose their true nature without you having to say a word. Silence isn't inaction. It's a way of letting things unfold without unnecessary interference. I remember a time when I learned this the hard way. There was a moment when I was desperate to fix something, a misunderstanding, a conflict that I felt needed to be resolved immediately. I kept talking, kept explaining, kept trying to make the other person see my side. But the more I pushed, the worse it got. It was only when I stopped, when I stepped back and let things breathe, that clarity came. The situation worked itself out. Not because I forced it, but because I allowed space for things to settle. That's the thing about silence. It gives room for truth to rise to the surface. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Silence doesn't just influence external situations, it transforms you internally. It rewires the way you think, the way you react, the way you carry yourself. When you start practicing silence, you start noticing something strange. You don't get as easily irritated. You don't feel as compelled to react to every little thing. You start feeling this sense of stillness inside you. And that stillness, that's the foundation of real strength. Seneca talked about this when he said we suffer more in imagination than in reality. So much of our stress, our anxiety, our frustration, it comes from over-engaging with things that don't deserve our energy. We create problems in our minds by overthinking, overanalyzing, overreacting. But when you cultivate silence, when you train yourself to sit with your thoughts rather than reacting to them, you start breaking free from that cycle. And this is the kind of silence that leads to something even greater, peace. Not the fleeting kind, not the kind that comes from temporary distractions, but the kind that stays with you, no matter what's happening around you. A kind of unshakable, immovable calm. That's why some of the most powerful figures in history valued solitude. They knew that in silence, they could hear themselves clearly. They could separate what was important from what was just noise. And that gave them a kind of clarity, a kind of perspective that most people never have. So here's my challenge to you. Over the next few days, start paying attention to the moments where you would normally speak, react, explain, defend, and try silence instead. See what happens when you pause, when you let things play out without your interference. Notice how it changes your relationships, how it shifts the way people respond to you, how it makes you feel inside. Because once you start mastering silence, once you start using it intentionally, you'll see why the Stoics treated it as one of the most powerful tools a person can have. Not just for control, not just for influence, but for something even greater. The ability to move through life with a deep sense of freedom, peace, and unshakable strength. And in the next part of this video, we're going to take this even further. We're going to look at how silence can be the key to mastering not just yourself, but your entire reality. How it can change the way you experience life, how it can unlock doors you didn't even know existed, and how it can give you something that most people spend their entire lives chasing: true inner power. You don't want to miss it. There's something fascinating about the way silence can shift your entire perspective on life. Not just in conversations, not just in conflict, but in the way you experience the world itself. Once you start using it intentionally, you begin to see things you never noticed before. And more importantly, you start to see yourself differently. Most of us are so used to reacting, to external noise, to other people's words, to the constant stream of distractions pulling at our attention, that we never stop to ask, what's actually worth responding to? We assume that every situation, every challenge, every opinion thrown our way demands our engagement. But the truth? It doesn't. And the more you understand this, the more you start to reclaim something incredibly rare, your inner power. Think about a moment when someone said something that bothered you. Maybe they questioned your choices. Maybe they dismissed your ideas. Maybe they threw out a casual insult, something designed to get under your skin. Your instinct? Defend yourself. Explain. Prove them wrong. But what happens if you don't? What happens if you just let their words drift by like leaves in the wind? It feels strange at first, unnatural even. Because we've been trained to believe that silence equals weakness, that if you don't respond, you're allowing yourself to be walked over, disrespected. But the reality is, silence in those moments isn't weakness at all. It's a form of self-mastery. It's a declaration that you don't need validation from anyone, that their words hold no real weight unless you let them. Epictetus once said, if someone speaks badly of you, do not defend yourself against their accusations, but reply, you obviously don't know me very well. Otherwise you would have said much worse. That's the level of detachment the Stoics aimed for. They understood that other people's words are just noise, meaningless unless you give them power. And when you refuse to engage, when you meet provocation with calm, you force the other person to confront their own behavior. You make them realize they have no control over you. And That's real strength. But silence isn't just about dealing with criticism. It's also about knowing when not to interfere with life itself. This is something that took me years to understand, learning to trust that not everything needs my input, my correction, my intervention. Have you ever been in a situation where you wanted so badly to fix something? Maybe a friend was making a mistake. Maybe a relationship was slipping through your fingers. Maybe you saw something unfolding that you felt you could steer in the right direction. But no matter what you said, no matter how much you tried to control the outcome, it only seemed to get worse. And then at some point, you stepped back. You stopped forcing, you let it be, and somehow things started falling into place on their own. That's the universe at work. That's what happens when you allow silence to do what words can't. There are times when the wisest thing you can do isn't to fight or push, but to simply step back and observe, to let events unfold without interference. Because often, the more you try to control something, the more resistance you create. But the moment you release your grip, things start moving in ways you never expected. Seneca wrote, "Fate leads the willing and drags along the unwilling." Think about that. You can either flow with life, accepting that some things are beyond your control, or you can resist, fight, struggle, only to realize later that your struggle was never necessary. Silence is often an act of surrender, but not in the way people think. It's not about giving up. It's about recognizing that not every battle is yours to fight. And that applies to more than just personal situations. It applies to how you process the world itself. Right now, we live in an age where everyone has an opinion about everything. Social media, the news, the constant flood of information, it's all designed to pull you in, to make you react, to keep you in a cycle of endless engagement. And the more you feed into it, the more it consumes your energy. But have you ever considered the power of simply not responding? Not getting involved? Not giving your mental space to every controversy, every outrage, every passing trend? It's one of the greatest freedoms you can give yourself. The ability to look at something, recognize that it doesn't serve you, and let it pass without engagement. Marcus Aurelius had a technique for this. When he encountered something upsetting or frustrating, he would pause and remind himself, "This is outside of my control. It does not concern me." And just like that, he would let it go. Imagine how much more peace you'd have in your life if you did the same. Because silence isn't just about the words you don't say, it's about the energy you don't waste. It's about conserving your focus, your emotions, your mental space for the things that truly matter, the things that deserve your attention. And the more you practice this, the more you start to notice something incredible. The world doesn't actually need your constant involvement. Things continue without you. Conversations move on. Problems resolve themselves. People find their own way. And you get to keep your peace. You get to keep your power. You get to live on your own terms, rather than constantly being pulled into other people's chaos. I want you to try something. Over the next few days, whenever you feel the urge to react, to insert yourself, to prove something, pause. Just pause. Take a breath. Ask yourself, do I need to respond to this? Or is this just noise? And if it's just noise, let it pass. Watch what happens. Watch how different the world feels when you realize you don't have to carry the weight of every single moment. Because once you truly understand the power of silence, you won't just be practicing self-restraint. You'll be stepping into a completely new way of living. One where your energy is your own, your mind is your own, your life is your own. And that's something most people will never experience. But we're not done yet, because there's still one more piece to this. One more way silence can completely transform not just the way you interact with the world, but the way you shape your own reality. In the next part of this video, we're going to dive into something even more powerful. The ways silence can be used to train your mind, strengthen your focus, and create a level of clarity that most people never achieve. And once you understand this, you'll see why the greatest thinkers, the most disciplined leaders, and the wisest individuals throughout history have all come to the same conclusion. Those who master silence, master themselves. Trust me, you don't want to miss this. There's a moment of clarity that comes when you finally embrace silence. Not as something passive, not as avoidance, but as a tool. A force that, when wielded correctly, can shape the way you think, the way you react, and the way you experience the world itself. Most people never reach this point. They spend their entire lives filling the gaps with noise. Not just external noise, but the kind that runs on a loop in their own minds. The overthinking, the endless internal dialogue, the worry about what others think, what might happen, what should have happened. It's a kind of mental clutter that never stops, never quiets down, unless you learn how to take control of it. And that's where silence becomes something even more powerful than restraint. It becomes a discipline. Marcus Aurelius understood this better than most. He was an emperor, responsible for the fate of an entire empire, yet he still made time, every day, to sit with his own thoughts in complete stillness. No advisors, no distractions, just silence. Why? Because he knew that clarity doesn't come from constantly thinking, reacting, or overanalyzing. It comes from creating space, from stepping back, from letting the mind settle, so that when you do need to act, you do so from a place of certainty, not impulse. Think about the last time you made a decision you regretted. Chances are you rushed into it. You reacted too quickly, didn't give yourself time to process. Maybe it was in an argument, maybe it was a business choice, maybe it was something small, an email you fired off too soon, a text you wish you could take back. Now imagine if you had paused, if you had given yourself just a moment of silence before acting. How different would that situation have played out? Silence gives you space to think clearly, but it also does something else. It strengthens your mind. Most of us don't realize how mentally weak we've become because we've never actually trained ourselves to sit in stillness. We avoid silence because it's uncomfortable. It forces us to be alone with our own thoughts, and for a lot of people, that's terrifying. So we reach for distractions. We scroll through our phones, turn on music, fill every empty moment with something, anything, to avoid confronting ourselves. But what happens when you stop running from silence? What happens when you sit with it, embrace it, let it reshape the way you process the world? That's when something truly incredible starts to happen. Your focus sharpens. Your mind becomes clearer. You stop getting pulled into every little distraction, every unimportant detail, every fleeting emotion. You start to develop a level of mental discipline that most people will never have. And this is exactly why the Stoics trained themselves in silence. They knew that if you can master your mind, you can master anything. They would practice long periods of stillness, reflection, even going as far as deliberately depriving themselves of comfort just to strengthen their ability to endure discomfort. Because if you can sit with yourself in silence, if you can train your mind to be calm, to be focused, to resist the pull of constant stimulation, then suddenly the world doesn't have as much control over you. You become unshakable. There's a reason why some of the most powerful leaders in history have been masters of silence. They weren't just good at not speaking. They were good at not reacting. They had the ability to sit in stillness while everyone else was panicking, to hold back when everyone else was rushing forward. And because of that, when they did act, when they did speak, their words carried weight. Their decisions had clarity. I once knew someone who had this kind of presence. He was one of those people who never spoke just to speak. He didn't fill space with unnecessary words. He wasn't the loudest in the room. But when he did say something, everyone listened, because he had thought about it first. He had given himself the space to process, to decide whether his words were necessary, whether they added value. And that's something rare. That's something most people don't have, because most people don't understand the power of deliberate silence. But here's the thing, silence isn't just about what you don't say. It's about how you listen. And that's where real mastery comes in. When you stop feeling the need to constantly contribute, to prove something, to fill space with your own voice, you become something far more valuable. You become the kind of person who actually hears what others are saying. Most people listen just to respond. They're already thinking about their reply before the other person has even finished speaking. They're waiting for their turn, ready to jump in, eager to be heard. But when you practice real silence, when you actually listen with the intent to understand, not just to reply, you start noticing things most people miss. You hear what's beneath the words. You pick up on subtleties in tone, in body language, in hesitation. And because of that, you start to understand people on a completely different level. Imagine how that changes your relationships, your conversations, your ability to navigate situations with clarity and purpose. Imagine how it feels to not just hear people, but to truly understand them. Not because you're rushing to speak, but because you've trained yourself to observe first, act second. This is why the most respected people, the ones we look up to, aren't the ones who dominate conversations. They're the ones who make you feel heard, who make their words count, who speak only when they have something worth saying. And that's the kind of person silence can turn you into. So here's what I want you to think about. How often do you speak just to fill space? How often do you listen just to respond, rather than to understand? How often do you react impulsively instead of giving yourself a moment of stillness to decide whether your words are even necessary? Because once you start noticing it, you'll realize something. Most things don't actually need your words. Most situations, most conflicts, most conversations, they resolve themselves without your interference. And when you start pulling back, when you start using silence intentionally, you don't just become more respected, you become more powerful. Because you're not just controlling what comes out of your mouth, you're controlling your mind, your focus, your energy. And this is where everything we've talked about so far starts to come together. The ability to not react, to not over-explain, to not let noise pull you in, it all leads to something even greater. Something that goes beyond just self-discipline or control. It leads to mastery over yourself. And that's what we're going to explore in the next part of this video. Because silence isn't just a tool, it's a path to something most people will never reach. A kind of inner power that can't be shaken no matter what's happening around you. And once you understand that, once you fully embrace it, everything, your confidence, your decisions, your entire way of moving through the world will change. And trust me, you're going to want to hear this. There's something deeply liberating about reaching the point where you no longer feel the need to explain yourself, defend yourself, or react to every little thing that happens around you. It's like stepping into a different version of yourself, one that is no longer controlled by the noise of the world, but instead guided by something much stronger, inner stillness. Think about it. How much of your life has been spent reacting? How many times have you said something just to fill silence? Just to make someone else more comfortable, just to avoid feeling like you weren't participating enough? How many arguments have dragged on simply because neither side could bear to let silence settle? How many hours of your life have been consumed by defending yourself against things that never even needed a defense? There's a moment that happens when you start practicing silence in your daily life. At first, it feels strange, like you're holding something back, like you're resisting a reflex. But then something shifts. You begin to notice how much energy you were wasting before. You see how many words you would have thrown into the air just to prove a point that never really needed proving. And you start to feel something you might not have felt in a long time. Peace. Marcus Aurelius understood this better than most. He ruled one of the most powerful empires in history, yet his greatest battle was never against external enemies. It was against himself. Against his own impulses, his own reactions, his own mind. He reminded himself daily to pause, to reflect, to let go of the need to control what was outside of him. Because he knew that true mastery wasn't about winning arguments or overpowering others, it was about mastering the self. And that's where silence becomes something more than just a strategy. It becomes a way of life, a form of discipline that stretches into everything you do. It's in the way you listen, really listen, without waiting for your turn to talk. It's in the way you handle conflict, knowing that most arguments don't need to be won, they just need to be left alone. It's in the way you move through the world, no longer feeling the need to engage with every little thing that tries to pull you in. But here's where it gets even more interesting. When you start practicing this kind of silence, when you stop reacting, stop defending, stop explaining, you begin to see how much more powerful your words actually become. Because now when you do speak, people listen. Your words aren't just more deliberate, they carry weight. You're not just another voice adding to the noise. You're someone who speaks only when necessary, Someone whose presence commands attention, not because it's loud, but because it's measured. Think about the most respected people you know. Are they the ones who talk the most? Or are they the ones who choose their words carefully, who pause before they speak, who never feel the need to prove themselves through endless talking? There's a reason people listen to them, because their silence makes their words valuable. And this is the part of silence that most people never reach. It's not just about holding back. It's about choosing wisely, knowing when your voice is needed and when silence is the stronger choice. It's about developing the kind of presence that makes others lean in when you do speak, not because you're trying to impress them, but because they know that when you say something, it matters. This applies to every part of life, in relationships, in leadership, in moments of decision-making. The ability to hold silence, to let things unfold without interference, to resist the pull of unnecessary words, it creates a kind of inner stability that most people will never understand. Because most people are still chasing validation, still trying to prove something, still afraid of being unheard. But when you embrace silence, you realize something profound. You don't need to be heard to be powerful. You don't need to explain yourself to be understood. You don't need to defend yourself to be respected. Your presence, your stillness, your ability to hold back when necessary, that says more about you than words ever could. Seneca once said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." But the real lesson here isn't just about listening to others. It's about listening to yourself, to the thoughts that arise in moments of stillness, to the clarity that comes when you stop filling every space with noise, to the deep, unwavering calm that emerges when you no longer feel the need to engage in things that don't deserve your energy. Because in the end, that's what silence really gives you. Not just power, not just control, but freedom. The freedom to walk away from conversations that drain you. The freedom to hold your peace in moments of chaos. The freedom to let go of battles that don't need to be fought. The freedom to exist in the world on your own terms, without constantly being pulled in every direction by the expectations of others. And when you master this, when you stop seeing silence as a lack of something and start seeing it as a presence in itself, everything changes. Your relationships shift, your confidence grows, your mind clears, and suddenly, you're no longer just reacting to life, you're leading it. So the question is, how will you use this? How will you take what we've talked about and apply it to your own life? Where can you choose silence instead of unnecessary words? Where can you hold back instead of reacting? Where can you listen instead of waiting for your turn to speak? Because if you do this, if you truly commit to mastering silence, you'll start to see something remarkable. You'll see that the less you speak, the more you understand. The less you explain, the more people respect you. The less you react, the more you control your own world. And once you experience that, once you feel what it's like to move through life with this kind of presence, this kind of calm, you'll never want to go back to the noise.